according to the theory of evolution, the origin and development of the universe and all its systems can be explained solely on the basis of time, chance, and continuing processes. All living things have arisen from a single-celled organism. A second and opposing worldview is the concept of creation. According to the theory of creation, everything in the universe has come into being through the design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. That means this creator created the universe, the earth, and all life on earth, including all types of plants and animals, as well as humans. On today's edition of Origins, the rocks cry out, the earth is young.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. My name's Don Chapman, and it's my privilege to be your host. Today we have with us a tremendous guest. Dr. Terry Mortensen is with us. He is a speaker with Answers in Genesis. And Answers in Genesis believes that the earth is young, as does Dr. Morrison. And he believes that part of the evidence for that is in the rocks. And so our show today is The Rocks Cry Out, the Earth is Young. And Dr. Mortensen, we want to welcome you to the show today.
Good to be with you again, Don.
It's great to have you with us. And I don't hear anything from these rocks, so you're going to have to help me.
Okay. Well, to begin with, Don, we have to understand that all of the scientists, whether they're creationists or evolutionists, have the same facts, the same rocks and fossils, the same earth.
Everybody's looking at the same evidence.
That's right. But no scientist goes out and looks at things with an empty mind. They have assumptions. They have expectations of what they expect to see based on their education, their worldview. And so if you start with naturalistic assumptions and look at those rocks and fossils, you will come up with an old earth, millions and millions of years. But if you start with biblical assumptions and look at those same rocks, you will see things differently. You will even see things that the evolutionists missed, and you will come up with a young earth view. Up until the 19th century, the dominant view was that the earth was as old as the Bible said, about 6,000 years old, and that the flood of Noah was a worldwide catastrophe and responsible for the rocks and the fossils. But at the beginning of the 19th century, we had a group of men called the scriptural geologists. They were defending that biblical view that had been held by most people for 18 centuries in Europe, where science was born. And they believed in a supernatural creation week, 6 literal days of creation, just as Genesis talks about. And then about 1,600 years later, that was followed by Noah's flood, which those who looked at the rocks believed that the rocks were a testimony to Noah's flood. And then things continued over the next 4,000 years up to the present time. And things will continue until there's a supernatural ending to the world. So a supernatural beginning and supernatural ending based on the biblical teaching about the world. But in the early 19th century, you had a view that began to replace that. It was called the catastrophist view. And George Cuvier, a Frenchman, and William Smith, an Englishman, were very influential in the development of this view. And they believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in a God, so they didn't believe this world was here just by accident or eternal. But they believed that Earth history was much, much longer, untold ages. That view reigned in geology for about 30 years at the beginning of the 19th century, but it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. Comes from the word uniform, and you can see on the timeline here that the uniformitarians rejected any idea of a global or regional catastrophe. And by about 1840, when geology became a profession, every student who went to university to study geology learned the uniformitarian way of interpreting the rocks, the uniformitarian assumptions. And so all the science departments, the science journals became controlled by this uniformitarian assumption. And we need to understand that to understand a quote that I'm going to read now from an evolutionary geologist. He died a few years ago, and in his book that I'm going to quote from, he actually warned creationists like me from using anything in his book to support our view. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Truth is truth wherever you find it.
That's right.
Okay.
So I'm going to quote him anyway. He's dead, so it doesn't matter. But he said this in a chapter on the 19th century, a little historical summary. He said, "My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I have been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians." In this author's mind, that's the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. That's a very telling statement.
Now help me with that. What were the social and political conditions that led to that conclusion?
Well, you had, just before this time, you had the French Revolution, which was a bloody change of, from the monarchy to democracy. And the British were looking at that and said, we don't want that. We want slow, gradual change, politically and socially. And they took those political ideas and applied them to geology. This atheist, evolutionist geologist is saying. And he's right. He's right. But he goes on to say this in that quote. In other words, he's speaking to his fellow geologists. We have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. This is very important because it's important for us to see that people, what they are taught can affect what they see in the rocks. Now let me illustrate it this way.
All right.
Here we have a fact.
Okay.
We got two yellow curved lines. And the question I want to pose to you is, what is missing? What was this originally? And I ask that to the viewers who are watching. As you look at this, what do you think is missing? Let me give you some possible options. You can vote there in the privacy of your own home. Nobody will treat you badly if you get the wrong answer. So let's look at that. Was it A? Do you think that's what the picture was originally? Or how about B? How about C?
That's a good one.
Here's the one that most people vote for when I give this lecture publicly. They think it was a circle originally.
Okay.
But you know what the correct answer is? The correct answer is nothing is missing, because that's the way the picture was drawn. But now look at what happened. When I showed you this picture and I asked you what's missing, I was brainwashing you. I was putting, by the question, I was putting into your mind, something's missing. I got to figure out what's missing. And so I brainwashed you to make you look for things that weren't there. So our philosophical assumptions, our worldview, affects what we see, and it also affects what we interpret.
Okay, now that's an interesting example that somebody drew, but can you give us an example out of geography, out of geology, from the world that this is happening?
Yeah, there's a really interesting example, and this could be multiplied, but this is very interesting. Out in the eastern part of the western part of the United States, in eastern Washington, is a vast area called the Scablands, 15,000 square miles and 39,000 square kilometers for our viewers in other countries. And it's a beautiful area of valleys and hills and rugged area, lots of waterfalls like the Palouse Falls. And for decades, the evolutionary geologists said this was carved slowly by millions and millions of years of slow, gradual erosion. But if you go to a website today on the Scablands, written by secular and evolutionary geologists, they will tell you that this was carved in 1 to 2 days by floodwaters.
The evolutionists admit that now.
Absolutely. They realize that well, let me show you a map here. here is the area. Here's eastern Washington. This is the Scablands. And this area was carved in 1 to 2 days, they're now saying. And there was a scientist, a geologist, who was out in this part of the United States, a field geologist. He was not a university professor. And he was walking through those rocks, and he just said, the rocks are screaming catastrophe. And he couldn't figure out, though, where the source of the water was. He wrote some articles in the scientific literature, and most of the geological establishment just scoffed at him. But then another geologist was looking up in this area of Idaho and Montana, and he said, I think I found the source of your water. And so the geologists now believe that this was a glacial lake that breached a natural dam, maybe a ice dam or something else, and that this water from this whole lake poured through this region, doing catastrophic excavation in a very short period of time. Now, there's an interesting article about this in Natural History. Stephen Jay Gould, who died just a couple of years ago, America's most famous evolutionist and a professor at Harvard University, and an atheist, but a very honest scientist in many regards. He said this about this whole issue of Harlan Brett saying this was formed catastrophically, and the geological establishment saying, no, it wasn't. He says, the establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. You see that? That's really important right there.
General principles.
They didn't go out and look at the rocks. They just said, you're wrong, because everything has to be explained by slow, gradual process.
It doesn't fit our matrix.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, Gould goes on to say, Brett's, the man who was saying catastrophe, stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the grandfather of geological gradualism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change.
Not the fact,
right,
but the doctrine.
Right.
The view
notice,
through which you worked at this.
Dogma.
Yes.
Dogma? We think of dogma and doctrine in religion.
That's right.
It's
and
right
it is
here
a religion, isn't it?
It's right here in geology.
Yes. Isn't that? Those are fascinating words.
So again, we all have the same facts. If you start with the assumptions that there were no regional or global catastrophes, it's not even possible in our thinking, then you'll get a slow, gradual interpretation.
Now, Terry, can there be a chain reaction once that they've established that they're in the Scablands? That happened in a day or two. Through those same eyes now, can they look at the Grand Canyon or other places and say, maybe this is what happened here as well? Is that happening today?
Well, that certainly is happening. In fact, Derek Ager, who I quoted before, was part of a movement within evolutionary geology called neo-catastrophism. They were going back to the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists.
Yes.
But they're all unbelievers. They're not trying to harmonize with the Bible.
Right.
But more and more they're saying that the rocks show evidence of catastrophic deposition and erosion. So what we see really confirms that. Here's another example, the Grand Canyon, which you just mentioned. Here's the Grand Canyon, 4 to 18 miles wide, 270 miles long, a mile deep. And when you stand at the Grand Canyon and you look out, you can see, especially if you get in an airplane, you can see all these other erosional features over hundreds of miles. But here's the interesting thing. These are obviously erosional features. Water used to be lapping there. And yet you look at the layers that you can see at the edge of the Grand Canyon, and they're just like pancakes, stacked one on top of another. There's no evidence of this kind of erosion on the surface here in the layers. And that indicates that this whole mass of sediments was deposited rapidly. The evolutionists say that this amount was, here it is, the Grand Canyon, they say that this was deposited over 300 million years. But where's the erosional evidence in the layers? You can see them here. They're just as flat as a pancake.
Right.
For hundreds of miles. And there's no evidence in between the layers of this kind of erosion over millions of years. So it just doesn't fit. For many decades, the National Park Service at the Grand Canyon said the Little Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon over millions and millions of years. But that is just not logical. The evidence is screaming some kind of catastrophic erosional event. And creationists believe that the rock layers themselves were deposited by Noah's flood, and the canyon was carved shortly after the flood in a post-flood erosional event similar to the Scablands.
You're sure making sense to me.
Yeah. What about fossilization? You know, a lot of people think it takes millions of years to form fossils. Well, here's a quote from two evolutionists in a book on dinosaurs. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now, just stop and think about that a minute.
Yeah.
How do they know that it can take millions of years to form a fossil? Has any geologist observed this process for millions of years?
No, I think only a really old one, but I don't think we have any of that old.
Could we string a bunch of geologists together so that their careers would overlap to observe? No, how do they know that? They don't.
They assume that.
That's an assumption.
That's
but
right.
how do they know it happens in a few hours?
Now that they could observe.
That's observational science. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of, what's that?
Weeks.
Weeks. Doesn't take millions of years. In fact, most fossils have to form rapidly or they wouldn't form at all. They'd be eaten by scavengers, micro-decay organisms.
They just can't lay in one place long enough to do that. Right.
So, you know, when they dig up a fossil, they don't find it with a label saying millions of years. That's just an assumption. And we've got evidence of fossils that obviously they were buried rapidly. Here's an ichthyosaur fossilized in the act of giving birth. That creature had to be buried rapidly, fossilized rapidly. Wow. Here's a fish fossilized in the act of eating its lunch. Fish degenerate rapidly.
Happened quickly.
Yep. And rock formation doesn't take a long time either. When I was working on my PhD, I read an article called Magic in the Marsh in a newspaper, and it was talking about rock forming very rapidly on the seacoast of the eastern part of England. And there was an interesting statement in here. It said, without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes.
It usually takes.
Now, how do they know it usually takes? Here we go again. This is not observation.
It's fun, Terry, with you to sit here and see what's the fact and what's the assumptions.
Yep, and what's the interpretation. And they go on to say, Professor Coleman said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible. You see, it was the beliefs, the assumptions in their minds. And they even talk about fossils forming very rapidly. So these things don't take millions of years. In fact, they can't really happen unless it happens quickly. And what about erosional events? Well, we've already alluded to that, but here's a flood, just a normal flood in Texas. The water's moving 600 times faster than normal. What kind of damage would that water do? Well, when it all slowed down, it eroded right through solid rock, right through the road.
Wow.
And here's the kinds of boulders that water was carrying. Here's a man back here for scale.
And those rocks were being moved by that water.
That moving water.
And that's just a small localized flood.
That's right.
Friends, we're going to take a break right now, but Terry has some fascinating things to share with us. I think he's given us some great quotes today. So don't go away and come back. We're going to wrap this up together, and I think you're going to really learn some things that just might change the way you're looking at the rocks around you and what they have to say. We'll see you in just a minute.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. The bird feather. It couldn't just happen. For their weight, feathers are stronger than any man-made structures. The design and functions of a feather are even more astounding. Evolutionists claim that reptile scales evolved into feathers. Feathers have a much more complex DNA structure than reptile scales. There is virtually no similarity between the two, nor is there any fossil evidence showing the transition from scale to feather. So how can evolutionists claim this really happened? Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Terry Mortensen, is also the author of a new book entitled The Great Turning Point. You'll definitely want this book for your personal library. Book orders are being taken at 1-800-778-3390. That's 1-800-778-3390. Dr. Mortensen is also a speaker, researcher, and writer for Answers in Genesis. For more information, write to Answers in Genesis, P.O. Box 510, Hebron, Kentucky 41048, or visit them online at www.answersingenesis.org.
Hi, welcome back to Origins. I'm here with my friend Dr. Terry Mortensen, and we are talking about dating rocks and fossils and how quickly that can happen through catastrophe. And then all of a sudden we have this beautiful picture of Mount St. Helens. That's before it blew its top in 1980?
Yep, that's right.
And what does that have to do with dating rocks?
Well, it's been a very revealing event. Here at the base of Mount St. Helens is Spirit Lake, and there weren't any boats on that lake on the morning of May 18th, 1980.
For which we can praise God.
Yeah, because that mountain blew its top.
Wow.
About 1/3 of the mountain was blown off by that volcanic eruption, and in this time period after that, there began to be down here in the crater a volcanic dome that began to develop as lava continued to ooze into the volcano there, and. So this is looking down from the volcano up there. Here we have the volcanic dome, and we're looking down into Spirit Lake now. And Dr. Steve Austin, who's a young earth creationist, a PhD geologist, got his PhD at Penn State University, he climbed up on that mountain and got some rock samples. He was taught by his evolutionary professors how to take rock samples and prepare them. He sent them off to a laboratory that does radiometric dating, the dating methods that supposedly prove these rocks are millions of years old. And the laboratory applied 4 different methods, and they sent the results back to Dr. Austin, saying that these rocks are 340,000 to 2.8 million years old.
Now, they didn't know where he had gotten those rocks.
Yeah, I don't think they did.
Yeah, it's a blind test. Okay.
Right. And now, we have to understand what these methods are saying, telling us is when the lava crystallized to become hard rock.
Right.
And we know these dates are completely false because we know when the volcano erupted and the lava dome formed after the eruption.
So it's less than 25 years old.
That's right. And oftentimes evolutionists will say, well, we will admit that there are some problems, but our dates aren't off by millions of years.
So they're only off 339 million a few thousand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a problem, but this is not the only example. There are lots of examples published in the scientific literature when they use the radiometric dating methods on rocks of known age where the volcano erupted in recent times. There were scientists there to observe it. The radiometric dates give us the wrong dates. And yet, when they apply the rocks to rocks of unknown, the dating methods to rocks of unknown age where they weren't there to observe it, they assume that the dating methods work.
Now, I don't call that good science, my friend.
That's not good science. It's not that they are not measuring the isotopes carefully. It's the assumptions in the methods that are leading the methods astray.
That's not scientific method being applied, is it?
Right.
Okay.
So, we kind of end where we were at before with the Grand Canyon. Again, the evolutionists say this was deposited over 300 million years. And yet there's dating problems with the rocks in this formation as well. And they are not really the testimony to millions of years as the evolutionists claim, but is really the testimony to Noah's flood and to a very young creation, relatively speaking. And people who want to study this more should go to our website at answersingenesis.org, where there's lots of articles about radiometric dating and what's wrong with these methods.
You know, I've got to tell you something, Terry, that I think the website at from Answers in Genesis is absolutely state-of-the-art. And anyone who enjoys looking things up on the web is going to really have a good time there and find some great truth. I just want to thank you for being with us today and for bringing us these answers. I'm hearing these rocks more clearly than I was at the beginning of the show. The rocks really are crying out, and they're saying to us that it makes sense to believe that God made it just like the Bible said He did. You know, I wonder if you have questions, my friends, that you would like us to talk about on Origins. I just would be so thrilled to hear from you. Write to me at Origins, CTV Wall, PA 15148, or there at the email address you see on the screen. Send me your comments, send me your questions. Perhaps you have a theme you'd like us to see covered on Origins. We'd be glad to do that. In the meantime, I just want to remind you that it's God's view that He made you. That ought to be your worldview too. God bless you, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 508 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins program number 508, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.